Welcome to Start with Hello, conversations about disability. In previous episodes, we've not been shy when it comes to speaking about sex and sexuality because, after all, why would we? If you're a ministry leader or a volunteer, if you're really anywhere in, I would say, any kind of ministry, and you haven't had a situation arise where you'll be addressing sex and sexuality, then don't worry, because that day will be here before you know it. And as this episode, I'm going to toss out a few questions to Ryan, and these are specific scenarios that have come up and that have happened with us, with me or him, or some that we know could happen. And we're going to discuss how we would recommend approaching those situations, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with real feelings, real emotions, real people, and real situations. And the truth is, we just can't avoid talking about them, and we have to be prepared, and we can't avoid it just because it's going to make somebody uncomfortable. So let's just jump right in. The first scenario I want to walk through is, I think this one's pretty similar to one that we touched on back in episode 11. So in that instance, we talked about a couple, and let's say that they're getting a little too close to each other. This one is pretty similar to that, but it's still, I think it's different enough to talk about. I think this is something that anybody's going to encounter. So let's just say that we have one individual who has been reported to have been peeking in a little too closely in the bathroom on another person. And when confronted, they admitted to staff that they had done that. And the person, I guess, that was spied upon, or however you want to phrase that, was extremely upset and they were uncomfortable. So gonna come right out of the gate swinging, Ryan. So I'm going to turn that over to you and let you give us the professional answer on how you would handle that one.
Oh man, the good old fashioned peeping Tom incidents. This is something that happens for different reasons. An individual may do this out of curiosity, or they may do it out of thinking that it's a funny thing to do, or it could be a sexually deviant motivation for the reasons why. In this situation, motivation does not matter. This is one of those zero tolerance issues that must be hit head on because it has real world consequences. If someone presses charges against an individual, they will likely not take into consideration other factors. They could end up being arrested, put on a sexual offenders list, banned from public places, including the church. If a person offended against does not press charges, there's a real possibility that they could take matters into their own hands and physically harm the person peeping on them. This truly is a no win situation. And that's why it must be dealt with immediately and with zero tolerance. This is a situation where I recommend that whenever this person is needing to use the restroom in the future, you give them two options. First, and this is probably the best option, that they only use a family restroom in the future by themselves. That way that there's no situation where they could be tempted to peep on someone else. Secondly, if a family restroom is not available, and it's a situation where they need to use the restroom quickly, always recommend that you send a staff member or you send a volunteer to tail them in the restroom. And I know this sounds terrible. You're not tailing to peep on them. You're just going to make sure that they use the restroom, they're in and they're out, and there's no funny business kind of going on. Obviously, these are situations that need reported within the church. So you're going to make a report with the church, because if there does become some legal situations, you need to have documentation, and we have great resources for that, Jason, don't we? That people can use for documentation's sake. But you always have to document. You always have to report to your direct report. With if you're a volunteer, that's a staff member. If you're a staff member, that means your direct report when it comes to kind of reporting up. So that's kind of what you need to do in these situations. Obviously, these are not fun or funny situations. These are situations that have real consequences. and must be dealt with appropriately.
And if anybody's listening and you're like, great, oh, where do I get these resources? We'll do a write up on the website and put everything in a single spot so that's easy to find. But I'd love for you to take a moment and talk about an experience you had years ago when you took your group to a minor league baseball game. So, from what I'm gathering, it was a hot summer afternoon, and you quickly spotted something that you knew needed to be addressed before things got out of hand. And I think that question that could mean a lot of things. So I'm hoping you'll give us some specifics.
Oh my goodness, yes. First, let me say that outings are always a wonderful thing for your ministry. Great thing that you should do. Just wonderful things. But when you're on an outing, you always need to be on high alert as a ministry leader or a volunteer, especially if you have people attending that outing that you know could be an issue in different ways. So here's the situation. We went to a minor league baseball game. It was a hot summer day. It was super fun. We loved it, but we had a situation at hand. I mentioned it was a hot summer day. And on this day, there were several ladies in the stands, not necessarily with our group, but in the stands around us that were taking advantage of that hot summer day and catching some sunshine and wearing what I would consider skimpy clothing. Well, we have some guys in our group. They have some issues regulating their hormones, and especially when they're around young women in general. So this only made things worse. We were partway through the game; things were going great. When one of our guys stood up, turned his back to the baseball field, and at first I didn't think anything of it, as I just figured he was getting up to use the restroom or go to the concession stand. But this young man just stood there with his back to the baseball game, and he was scanning the crowd. I could clearly see that he was scanning the crowd, and this has gone on, for more than a minute now. And then I saw the issue that needed to be addressed because I knew exactly what he was doing. Let's just say he was wearing some loose fitting sweatpants that day, and there was no hiding his excitement. I'm not sure if I ever moved so quickly from my seats at a baseball game, not even when I was attempting to catch a foul ball. This again, a zero tolerance issue. When you're in public, you have real world consequences. Not that you don't at church, but more so when you're on an outing, you're out in public. So I immediately turned our friend around, had him sit down. I instructed him very clearly at what was going to happen moving forward, and that if I noticed anything other than him watching and enjoying the baseball game, that I was going to have to call his parents and have them pick him up. This was an instance when I had to ask other volunteers to help to keep an extra set of eyes on him for the rest of the game because there's a handful of volunteers, several individuals there, and you can't always have your eyes on everyone at the same time. So again, these are situations that need to be more than just keeping people out of trouble. They should be situations that become teachable moments where we can help people understand God's plan for sexuality. And I'm glad that we have some resources that can help with that. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of those very soon.
And I think what I like about that was, and this is something that you actually brought up before we even hit the record button, was dignity. And I think as we handle these situations, we just to throw this out there, we were talking earlier before we started recording about an individual who was in the ministry and had an accident in the restroom, and he was terrified to come out of the restroom because he didn't want anybody to make fun of him. There's so many different ways that we can handle these things without dignity. So I was glad. It's good when you hear stories like this that had a good resolution with respect to really everybody involved, and that's something that we'll probably sit down and have another episode on some situations, right, that aren't necessarily sex and sexuality, but they might make people uncomfortable, might feel awkward, and how do we handle those with dignity? But to move on, I want to say this could really happen in other ministries, not just disability ministry, but I want to talk about the new couple that they're just madly in love with each other. They've been dating for 3 minutes and they're going to get married.
3 minutes.
And in fact, they are so much in love with each other that they feel the need to place their love on public display for all to see, and in sometimes ways that make every single person around them very, very uncomfortable. So, Professor Wolf, what would you do in this instance?
Oh, gracious, the PDA issue. This is an issue in disability ministry. It's an issue in youth ministry. It's an issue in other ministries. And my challenge for people, just like it is in so many different facets of disability ministry, is to treat it the same way that you would treat it if you were a youth pastor and you had teens that were too handsy. This is something that you would not allow, and it should be no different in disability ministry. Again, this is a teachable moment for leaders to help people understand God's plan for healthy sexuality. We have a one-page document that lays out perfectly for people in romantic relationships what it is that God wants for their lives. And I'd recommend that everybody download that resource. In this situation, it's going to be important to have those hard conversations with parents, staff, or caregivers. They need to be taught what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in public. The old adage goes, if they're comfortable doing those certain things in public, imagine or don't imagine the things that they are doing in private. Chances are they're not living out God's plan for healthy sexuality. And to enforce some of the proper boundaries, it's going to need to be a team effort. The lovebirds are going to need to hear the same message from their ministry leaders and volunteers that they're hearing from their parents, staff, caregivers. There needs to be a plan in place if they cannot follow the agreed upon boundaries or PDA. This is one that will not be difficult to police. As annoying as this type of situation is, there will be plenty of people in the room that will likely shout out when it is happening. Then it comes down to follow through and enforcing the healthy boundaries that have been agreed upon. You come up with a plan, you talk with their parents, staff or caregivers, whoever's bringing them, come up with what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and then you follow through on that situation. Make it a teachable moment. You share with them God's plan for healthy sexuality. I'd also like to mention, just briefly here, something that we could talk about in the future, which is the topic of marriage in the disability community. Chances are, like you said, these lovebirds have known each other for 3 minutes and they're planning on getting married. In some situations, it's a great situation, just like it is for any person with or without disabilities. For other situations, it's some things that need to really be discussed for people to help them see, what it really looks like to be married. And unfortunately, there can be additional roadblocks that exist when it comes to the marriage conversation for people with disabilities. Roadblocks that can be overcome if tackled together with some wise counsel. Anyways, this is a topic for another day involving what to do with lovebirds in disability ministry.
Yeah, I, for some reason, never even thought about the marriage conversation. I think that would be that would be a really fun episode to tackle, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people that have run into questions about that. Certainly, something we'll need to toss onto the schedule. But a year or so ago, I was talking with one of our friends in class, and they kind of mentioned something in passing that caught me off guard. I say caught me off guard. It really threw me for a loop. It was a comment, and I'm trying to be sensitive about how I say this, but the comment was something along the lines about how a relative of theirs had touched them. This was something inappropriate. I'll say that. Naturally, as soon as I heard that, I wanted to put the brakes on. I knew that it would be wrong for me to not take any action about that. I didn't want to just, oh, okay, well, you made that up. I know now, looking back, I know that we handled that at the church properly and the steps that we took with leadership. For those who have never run into a situation like this, how do you recommend going about it?
Yeah, these are the tough moments in ministry. These are the moments that are going to happen when, not if. Especially if you've been in ministry for a while, you're going to run into this. And I like to call this the hot potato situation. You never want to be the last person holding the hot potato. Because if you are the last person holding the hot potato and you've not done anything with it, you could be liable if you do not report it. In these situations, I always recommend that you immediately report up. And what I mean by that is if you're a volunteer, you immediately talk to a staff member. If you're a staff member, you immediately talk to your direct report on staff. You always report up the chain of command. This is not something that you run around the room to the other volunteers and start saying, "Oh my goodness, you'll never guess what I just heard." You want to handle this. Again, this is a dignity issue. Dignity and respect are super important in this type of situation. You don't want to start spreading it around the room because inevitably the whole room will know about it before you imagine, and then feelings are hurt. People are embarrassed. You always want to take it seriously, whether you believe it or not doesn't matter in these situations. I want to make that very clear. Whether you believe it or not, it does not matter in these situations. You have to take it seriously. You have to report it. You are required or mandated to report situations of abuse or neglect. And documentation is key in these situations. We have a great resource called What to Do When You Suspect Abuse and Neglect. We have a documentation form that you can download that will walk you through exactly what you need to document in these situations. I encourage everybody to download that. We also have a blog called How to Tackle Inappropriate Sexual Behavior. Now, this applies to several different things that we've talked about or will talk about today. But that's another good resource to help you kind of navigate these situations. The other thing that I would say about this situation is that timing is also very important. This is not something that you wait until you have your staff meeting later in the week so you can kind of report it up the chain. This is something that you have to report within 24 hours of receiving that information. And there are guidelines on how to report this. Again, it's all on our free documents or what to do when you suspect abuse and neglect. So, really encourage people to grab that. So, timing's important, documentation is important, reporting up is important. Always believe people when they tell you these different things, whether it's true or not, you take it seriously. And from there, you got to trust the process of reporting. And while you wait, because sometimes when you make these reports, sometimes you never hear anything from the authorities, which is frustrating and concerning. Sometimes you do hear things back immediately. But in the meantime, come up with a game plan to help the individual be safe. Again, these are situations that require these hard conversations, whether it be with a parent, staff member, or a caregiver. These are the moments in ministry where you can literally change or save a life from significant trauma. So, those are just a few things. Again, download those resources, have a copy of those resources in your ministry area so you don't have to go looking for it. You can just pull it out, hand it to the person that reports it, and have them start filling out the important information. That way, you, as the ministry leader, can take all that information that you need and make those phone calls. Sad that you have to encounter these things, but if you're equipped to know what to do in these situations, they become much less terrifying when you have to deal with them.
I like that where you mentioned whether you believe it to be true or not doesn't matter. The situation that I was in, the statement was kind of, it was sandwiched in between some statements that were clearly made up, just off the cuff, and then there was this in the middle. And it could be easy for anybody to say, well, in this whole 5 minutes of talking, you were just making things up and saying things that weren't true, silly things. So obviously that was in the middle, and that too could be labeled that way. But I didn't really look at it like the hot potato, but that makes a lot of sense. I just didn't want to leave class without telling somebody. And so I did that, pulled them to the side, said, hey, this is what I've heard. It's not up to me to determine truth
No,
or not.
nope.
And I was like, I don't want to hear something and dismiss it, and then to find out later something was true and I didn't do anything about that. I don't know if I could live with myself. And then I followed up
Yep.
with an email just to say, as soon as I got home, just, hey, I know we talked about this, but I just wanted to mention this. This is what was said to me. Thanks for helping out. And so, we talked about it, and the staff did great. They took it up the chain, and and I did hear back, and I felt it's always sad when, you find out something may or may not have happened, whatever, but in a way you kind of do feel good that some action was taken, that this person wasn't just left into the void. Thankfully, we do have those those resources, because if you didn't know, you're a new volunteer, or I think back on when my oldest daughter started volunteering. I wonder if she would have heard that. Would she know to follow these steps? You just want everybody to be prepared. But on a happier note, I guess I should say, some of our friends are extremely loving and caring. And again, this is something that we talked about before we started recording. Some of our friends can be really big huggers. And while there isn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily something wrong with a hug. It could make some people uncomfortable. And I think one of the things I was telling you is there's like two young ladies in our class, and I'm on the lookout for them, because when they come in, I try to be ready, because whenever I have my back turned, they'll just come hang over me, and it's innocent. There's a room full of people, nothing's inappropriate, but it just makes me uncomfortable. And then also, as a dad, like, I don't know if I would walk in, how would I feel, and if my daughter was just draped over one of the guys in the room? I don't know. It's weird. Maybe I think too much into it, but optics are important, I think. But so, is there, in your in your professional experience, is there a quote unquote official hugging policy out there that you can speak about?
Again, I think this is one of those things some churches handle and take more seriously than others, and some churches do come up with a no hugs policy. And it sounds so heartless, man. Like you said, probably 90% of the time it's innocent, but there is that chance that somebody may hug too long, may hug front to front. There's always that issue. A front hug lines up genitals, which is a problem. If you're, you know, this isn't necessarily a hug situation, but if you're like in disability ministry for kids, there's oftentimes the kids want to just plop down in your lap. And again, if somebody plops down in your lap, genitals are aligned, and that's where, trouble can be. So sometimes the best policy is just to have a policy that says no hugs, no lap sitting. And that takes care of it. There is no suspicion. There's no rumors. Nothing can come up if you have that policy in place and you enforce that policy. I know a lot of churches don't do that. And in those situations where you do allow hugs, this is something that I would encourage churches put in their volunteer handbooks. No front hugs, no lap sitting. If you're not going to make the no hug policy, make the policy that hugs must be side hugs. You're putting the arm across the shoulders of the person next to you. It's a side hug. Your sides are touching. That's it. Or come up with a policy that says, "Hey, we're going to be a fist bump and a high five church," and that's the contact, the physical contact that we're going to allow. Of course, this is something that is hard to enforce, but I would say practice makes perfect. Even for those individuals that love to run up and give you a hug, when you see them coming and they're making a beeline for you, actively take a step back, put a fist forward for a fist bump and say, "Hey, give me a fist bump," or "Hey, give me a high five." Over time, people will get it. There's a lot of individuals that over time, for example, at my church, it's now natural that whenever they see anyone, they put that fist out for a fist bump, and that's cool. It's cool to kind of have your own greeting. If you train and teach people how to make a greeting, and again, it's not that you're trying to be heartless. It's just that you want to be careful and you want to protect your volunteers from any potential trouble. There are always going to be those situations. Like I said, 90% of the time it's fine, but maybe 10% of the time you've got some of these guys or girls. This is not specifically a guy issue, or girls that like to linger a little bit too long on those hugs, and that's where things get uncomfortable. That's where you think, oh my gosh, what if somebody says something, innocent on my end, but you just don't want to leave yourself in those situations. So come up with a policy, whether it's no hugs or not, and stick to that policy. Put that in your policy manual, teach that at your yearly trainings, model that as a ministry leader. And over time, it will become natural. And I think just second nature as people come up to greet you.
Kind of related to that, and there's a policy that our church has, and at first you're like, come on y'all, this is just it's just too much. But when you think about it for 2 seconds, you're like, oh, okay, I like that. And it's you're never alone with somebody.
Yep.
And I love that. Like I'm actually thankful for that. And there's times where we're at camp and somebody had trouble going to the restroom, and I was a team leader, and they were like, hey man, I got to go to the restroom with so and so. Okay, I'll go. I was always excited when somebody asked for help like that, because I didn't want anybody to feel uncomfortable. But having multiple people around helps remove any doubt. That's a safeguard. So I love
Yeah.
the no hug
Yep.
policy. I love also saying, hey, no hugging. Also, you shouldn't be alone with anybody.
Yeah, yeah, we call that at our church kind of the two deep policy, two volunteers deep. So it's two adults, or if there's a teen volunteer, it's a teen and an adult. And that's one of those situations where you got to have the numbers and the volunteers to be able to follow through on the policy. And sometimes that's difficult, but this is things that you aim for when you're recruiting, so you can make sure that you keep people safe. And it's especially in those situations where they're going to the bathroom, or there might be a diaper situation with a child. If your church does allow diaper changing, it's a two deep policy. So there's always that second set of eyes to keep you safe. And in those situations, this is something that we always point out, that a husband wife team does not count as two people, because typically in court, the court is going to say the husband and the wife are going to side with each other on these situations. So too deep doesn't include like husband, wife, or whether it be a parent and a child type of volunteer team. So make sure they're different people as well. But yeah, great job pointing that out, Jason.
And I've actually seen, just to take that just a tad bit further, like if you are short on volunteers, that doesn't mean you're stuck in a room. I've seen that happen where they're like, hey, why don't you come sit with me? And they're over by the check-in kiosk, or they're over by the welcome center, or they go sit somewhere else that's near the entrance to the classroom, so that they are out in view and you're not in, a room there in the side. So there's a lot of ways. Maybe that's sounds like we've come up with several different episodes to
Sure.
talk about
Yep.
after this one. But one final scenario I want to walk through. So let's say somebody's using the restroom, and as a joke, they think it would be funny to flash another person as they come out of the restroom. And the person being flashed, they're now crying and near having a meltdown. And obviously, I think this would be dependent on where the church bathroom is. In our ministry, we actually have a restroom right there in the classroom. So hopefully, you wouldn't run into this at all. But it might be dependent, obviously, if the restroom is across the foyer. Hopefully, that wouldn't happen. But what would you do in a situation like that, where somebody thinks it's a joke and they've really kind of traumatized somebody else? So what do you do then?
Definitely a traumatizing situation for anybody viewing that. I would circle back to the first question that we tackled in this episode. Very similar to the peeping tom incident. What I mean by that. This is another zero tolerance situation with real world consequences that need to be dealt with immediately, because this is a situation where somebody can press charges. You can end up on, a sexual offenders list. You could be banned from public places like churches or schools. You can have a record. This is serious stuff. Whether the individual thinks it's funny as a joke or not, or whether the motivation is truly sexually deviant in nature, this is another one of those situations where motivation doesn't matter, and you have to handle this like immediately. This is a situation where you need documentation for the church. This is a situation where you immediately have to contact parents, staff, or caregivers, where this warrants kind of the sit down conversation where we talk about what is and is not appropriate in public. This is a situation where you need to talk to the person that was flashed. This is not something that as a church you're just gonna, just say, "Well, I hope nothing happens with this. I hope the person's okay." You're responsible for that person too. You're responsible for helping them. If it's a situation that's traumatizing, that person needs counseling. This is something the church should help with. This is something the church needs to come up with a game plan again for, for the individual when they go to the restroom. The individual probably needs to use a family restroom, or a situation where there's an individual restroom in the ministry area, or where there's someone that needs to tail them as a staff member or volunteer. So again, very similar to the first question that we tackled. But let me take this a little different direction, because this is something that I probably see more often than the flasher. Thankfully, I've never seen the flasher in any of my ministry areas. But there's several times I've encountered what I would call people unintentionally flashing people. I know that sounds impossible, but hang with me for just a moment. I'm sure anyone who's ever been in a men's restroom, when a young boy who's learning how to use the restroom is standing in front of a urinal and they drop their pants to the ground. They're essentially standing there naked with their backside exposed to anyone who walks in. Well, I've actually seen this in our disability ministry several times, where grown men will go to the bathroom, standing at the urinal in our main restroom, which has probably no joke, 12 to 15 urinals in a line on the wall. And I see one of our guys, I've seen this a couple times with different guys, where they're standing at the urinal and they literally drop their pants to the ground while they're standing there at the urinal. This is what I would call unintentional flashing. They're not doing this to be, sexually deviant, but it still doesn't stop those that are innocent bystanders from being traumatized, walking in a restroom to see a grown man with his pants on the ground as he's using the urinal. When you're walking by and you see that, you don't necessarily know, oh, that's, one of the guys from the disability ministry. They don't know better, so I shouldn't be traumatized. You're traumatized when you see that in public. So this is a situation where, as a ministry leader, we need to again have some of those uncomfortable conversations, whether it be with the individual. In this situation where it needs to be with the individual and their parents, their staff, or their caregivers, whatever the situation may be. And this is not only meant to save people from being traumatized, but it's also to help the individuals stay out of trouble and keep them from embarrassment. They may not even realize, chances are they don't realize, that they're doing something that's making other people feel traumatized or awkward. But this is, some of those situations where we can be like a coach for an adult and help them understand how to use the bathroom properly. It's one of those things in disability ministry that's not necessarily something that you are trained to do, but it's just one of those things that you jump in and do. It's an opportunity to care for the individual. It's another one of those dignity situations where you want to help the individual that you minister to and with. So it's one of those things that we have an opportunity to help everyone in the church in those situations.
I think it's a lot of awareness. And, as you were going through that scenario, I think I've encountered that at camp a handful of times. And but I hate to admit this, but I'm just going to be blunt. But before I was even involved in disability ministry, had I encountered an adult in the restroom who was, let's say, learning how to use the restroom and just drop their pants, I don't know if I would have had the compassion or understanding or grace to have considered that an option. And I hate that, but I think that there's probably a lot of people that would instantly feel like that there's, like you mentioned, there's a deviant, there's something wrong. And we don't know where every individual is.
No,
Maybe
we don't.
maybe they've been learning, and this is the first time that they've messed up in a while, or everybody's communicates so differently and learns differently. And I would just hope and pray that in a church setting, the first thought wouldn't be that there's criminal activity afoot.
Right.
So that's good that you pointed that out, and I hadn't even considered that scenario. So I mean, all of this stuff is great. It's all helpful, and we know it's important to talk about it. And I'm glad. I really am glad that we're talking about it, and even these uncomfortable situations. Because if we don't talk about it, how in the world are we going to be prepared for it when we encounter it? Because, as you know, you're going to encounter it. You can't avoid it the longer you're in this. And if anybody out there's listening, and let's say that you've got questions about this area, maybe you feel stuck, or even you're like, hey, I want to start a disability ministry, but these are the reasons why I don't. This scares me. Then we have free consultations. We love to walk with you through this. You can visit our website, abilityministry.com, and at the top right, you'll see a button that says I want to. If you just tap or click that and select get free consulting, Ryan or Bronwyn will set up a call and walk you through things and meet you where you are. And before I close this out, speaking of Bronwyn, I want to give a little teaser about the next episode. I'm lining up a conversation with her, and we'll be talking about her buddy system. So if you aren't already subscribed, give us a follow on whatever platform you're listening to from now on so you don't miss out. And in the meantime, go be the hands and feet of Jesus. Until next time. This episode of Start with Hello is brought to you by Disability is Beautiful. 1 in 5 people in the world live with a disability, so it shouldn't be difficult to find lots of images to represent this. However, that's not always the case. Disability is Beautiful provides an exhaustive library of art provided by and for the disability community. Our photos reflect the beauty, diversity, and strength of the disability community. Whether you're a business owner, a content creator, or an advocate, Disability is Beautiful has photos for use in blogs, websites, social media, printed materials, business, nonprofit, or personal projects. Visit disabilityisbeautiful.com and create your free account and help us change the face of stock photography.